Hey there, weary traveller. Welcome to this quiet corner of history where the shadows run deep and the stories whisper secrets that time has nearly forgotten. Whether you're settling in as the sun dips below the horizon or finding yourself restless in the small hours of the night, I'm glad you found your way here. Before we begin our journey into the dusty, dangerous world of ancient assassins, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and tell me what corner of the world you call home and what time it is as you press play. There's something deeply comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, yet gathered here together in the darkness, sharing these ancient tales. If this kind of gentle storytelling helps you drift towards sleep, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. We have many more shadowy paths to walk together in the weeks and months ahead. Now, settle back into your pillows, let your breathing slow, and allow me to paint you a picture of a world where death was a profession, where shadows held secrets, and where even the most skilled killers lived lives that were, quite frankly, absolutely miserable. You might think being an assassin sounds exciting, romantic even, the lone wolf, the master of stealth, the whispered name that makes kings tremble. But strip away the Hollywood glamour, peel back the layers of legend and myth, and what you'll find beneath is a reality so brutal, so unforgiving, that it would make even the most hardened warrior think twice about choosing such a path. This isn't a tale of noble warriors or righteous battles fought in the blazing sun. No, this is the story of men who worked in darkness, who lived on the knife's edge between life and death, and who discovered that the art of killing, no matter how perfectly mastered, came with a price that few were truly prepared to pay. So dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the world outside your window fade into distant memory. Tonight, we're traveling back 3,000 years to a world where empires rose and fell like waves on the shore, where gods walked among mortals, and where death could come from the most unexpected places. Picture, if you will, the dusty streets of ancient Jerusalem. The air hangs thick with the scent of incense from the temple, the sharp tang of metalwork from the smith's quarter, and underneath it all, the ever-present smell of too many people living too close together within walls that have seen more blood than rain. The year is roughly 850 BCE, and the world is a patchwork of kingdoms, city-states, and tribal territories, all locked in an endless dance of alliance and betrayal. The great empires of Egypt and Assyria loom like storm clouds on the horizon, while smaller powers scramble for position like merchants in a crowded marketplace. In this world, information is currency, secrets are weapons, and trust is a luxury that most cannot afford. It's a world where a whispered word in the right ear can topple a dynasty, where a dagger thrust in a dark alley can change the course of history, and where men have learned that sometimes the most effective way to solve a problem is to simply make it disappear. Enter our protagonist, though he would never think of himself in such terms. Let's call him Zifron, though names were fluid things in his profession, changing like shadows at sunset. He is what the ancient texts might delicately refer to as a destroyer of enemies, or more bluntly, a man who kills for coin. But Zifron's story, like the stories of all who walked his dark path, is not one of glamour or glory. It's a tale of constant fear, grinding poverty punctuated by brief moments of terrible wealth, and the slow erosion of everything that makes a man human. You see, being an assassin in biblical times wasn't like slipping poison into a goblet at a royal feast, or loosing a crossbow bolt from a tower window. The ancient world had its own particular brand of brutality, its own codes of honor and dishonor, and its own very specific ways of making life utterly miserable for those who chose to make their living in the shadows. First, there was the matter of actually learning the trade. In our modern world, we might imagine secret schools hidden in remote mountains, masters of stealth passing down ancient techniques to carefully chosen students. The reality was far more prosaic and infinitely more dangerous. Most assassins learned their craft the hard way through necessity, desperation, and sheer bloody-minded survival. Perhaps they were soldiers who found themselves on the losing side of a war, their armies scattered, their kings dead, their homes burned. Perhaps they were slaves who managed to escape their bonds but found themselves with no skills except violence and no place in civilized society. Zifron's own path to the shadows began, as so many did, with loss. His family had been small merchants in a border town, dealing in copper and tin, living a modest but comfortable life. Then came the raiders, Philistine warriors sweeping down from their coastal strongholds, and in one terrible night, everything he had known was reduced to ash and blood. He was perhaps 14 when he found himself alone, possessing nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning desire for revenge that gnawed at his belly like constant hunger. But revenge, he quickly learned, required skills he didn't possess, connections he couldn't make, and most importantly, the ability to kill without hesitation or remorse. The first man he killed was a Philistine soldier, drunk on wine and victory, who had made the mistake of wandering too far from his companions while relieving himself behind an olive grove. Zifron had waited in the shadows for 3 days, studying the patrol routes, learning their habits, before finally striking with a bronze dagger stolen from a dead man's belt. It should have been satisfying. It should have felt like justice. Instead, it felt like drowning. The reality of taking a life, even the life of an enemy, was nothing like the songs the warriors sang around their fires. There was no glory in the way the man's eyes widened in surprise and pain, no nobility in the gurgling sounds he made as his lifeblood spilled onto the dusty earth. There was only the terrible weight of what had been done, and the knowledge that there could be no taking it back. But worse than the act itself was what came after. Because in the ancient world, every death had consequences that rippled outward, like stones thrown into still water. The Philistine soldier had brothers in arms who would search for him. He had family who would mourn him. He had commanders who would demand explanations and exact retribution. Within days, the entire region was crawling with search parties, and Zifron found himself running for his life through terrain that offered few places to hide. The rolling hills of Judah, so beautiful in the soft light of dawn, became a maze of potential death traps. Every shepherd's hut might shelter enemies, every well might be watched, every road might lead to capture, and a death far more prolonged and unpleasant than anything he had inflicted. This, he learned, was the first great truth of the assassin's life. Every successful kill brought with it the promise of pursuit, and pursuit in the ancient world was a relentless thing. There were no police forces in the modern sense, no centralized law enforcement agencies with jurisdictional limits and bureaucratic procedures. Justice was personal, tribal, and absolute. If you killed a man, his family would hunt you. If you killed a family member, his tribe would hunt you. If you killed a tribal leader, his entire people would hunt you, and they would not stop until you were dead, or they were. The concept of statute of limitations did not exist. The idea of proportional response was laughable. Blood called for blood, and the debt could be inherited by sons and grandsons until the end of time. Zifron spent the better part of a year running from the consequences of that first kill, sleeping in caves and abandoned ruins, eating whatever he could scavenge or steal, always moving, always looking over his shoulder. He learned to recognize the sound of hoofbeats from miles away, to distinguish between the calls of different birds so he could tell when they were disturbed by approaching men, to move through undergrowth without leaving tracks that could be followed. These were valuable skills, essential skills for someone in his profession, but they came at a cost that went far beyond the physical hardships. Living in constant fear of discovery does things to a man's mind, shapes his soul in ways that cannot be undone. Zifron found himself jumping at shadows, starting awake at the slightest sound, unable to trust anyone or anything. Sleep became a luxury he could rarely afford. Even when exhaustion finally claimed him, his dreams were filled with the faces of the dead and the imagined faces of those who hunted him. He began to understand why the old soldiers he had known as a child sometimes stared into fires with haunted eyes, why they drank too much and spoke too little of the things they had seen and done. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that survival required him to kill again, not from desire for revenge this time, but from simple necessity. A merchant's guard who discovered him stealing food. A bandit who tried to rob him of the few possessions he had managed to acquire. Each death brought its own set of consequences, its own hunters, its own nightmares. The ancient world, you see, was not a place where a man could simply disappear. Communities were small and tight-knit. Strangers were noticed and remembered, and word travelled with surprising speed along the trade routes that connected every settlement to every other. A man with blood on his hands could not simply blend into a crowd and start a new life in a distant city. This was especially true for someone like Zifron, whose very appearance marked him as displaced, dangerous. The way he moved, the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats, the way his hand instinctively went to his weapon at unexpected sounds, all of these things marked him as clearly as if he wore a sign proclaiming his profession. And so began the second phase of his education in the art of killing, learning not just how to take life, but how to live with the consequences. This meant developing an entirely new set of skills that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with deception. He learned to affect different accents, to mimic the mannerisms of merchants and soldiers and pilgrims. He learned which lies were believable and which would raise suspicion, how to create false histories that would hold up under casual questioning, how to acquire documents and tokens that would support his assumed identities. But even these skills came with their own burdens. Living a lie is exhausting work, requiring constant vigilance and perfect memory. A single slip, a momentary lapse in maintaining character, could mean exposure and death. Zifron found himself creating elaborate mental maps of his various false identities, memorizing details about fictional childhoods and imaginary families, practicing stories until they felt as real as his actual memories. The psychological toll was immense. After months of living as different people, he sometimes found it difficult to remember who he really was underneath all the masks. The boy who had lost his family to Philistine raiders seemed like someone from a story he had heard long ago, a character from someone else's life. This fragmentation of identity was perhaps the most insidious cost of his chosen profession. An assassin could not afford to have friends, could not maintain long-term relationships, could not put down roots or build anything lasting. Every connection was potentially a weakness that enemies could exploit. Every moment of genuine human contact was a risk that might lead to discovery and death. The loneliness was perhaps the most unexpected burden of all. Zifron had anticipated danger, had prepared himself for violence and pain, and the constant threat of discovery. But he had not understood how the isolation would gnaw at him, wearing away at his soul, like water slowly carving channels through stone. In the small merchant town of his youth, he had been surrounded by the warm chaos of family life. His father's booming laugh echoing from the workshop, his mother's gentle humming as she prepared the evening meal, his younger sister's endless chatter about everything and nothing. Even the neighbours had been part of an extended web of connection, their lives intertwined through generations of shared joys and sorrows. Now, every interaction was calculated, every word weighed for its potential consequences. When he sat in taverns nursing watered wine and listening for useful information, he could not allow himself to truly engage with the other patrons. When merchants offered him work as a caravan guard, he had to constantly evaluate whether they might recognize something dangerous in his bearing. When children played in the dusty streets of whatever town he found himself in, their laughter was a reminder of everything he had lost and could never reclaim. The ancient world, for all its brutality, was fundamentally a communal place. Survival depended on belonging somewhere, on being part of a family, a tribe, a guild, something larger than oneself. Men were defined by their connections, their lineages, their place in the great web of obligation and loyalty that held society together. To be outside that web was to be less than human, a ghost walking among the living. Zifron learned to recognize others like himself by the way they held themselves apart, even in crowds, by the careful neutrality of their expressions, by the way they never quite relaxed, even when surrounded by apparent safety. They were the walking wounded of the ancient world, men and women who had been cut loose from everything that gave life meaning and purpose. Some had been exiled for crimes real or imagined. Others had fled disasters natural or man-made. A few, like Zifron himself, had chosen their path deliberately, trading connection for the cold freedom of the shadows. But regardless of how they had arrived at their isolation, they all shared the same haunted quality, the same careful way of moving through the world as if it might collapse beneath their feet at any moment. When assassins did encounter each other, which happened more often than one might expect in the surprisingly small world of professional killers, the meetings were exercises in mutual wariness. There might be a nod of recognition, a careful sharing of information about which routes were safe and which were watched, but never true camaraderie. Trust was a luxury that men in their profession could not afford, even with their own kind. This was because the ancient world's approach to law and order often involved turning criminals against each other. A captured assassin might be offered his freedom in exchange for information about his colleagues. A king's agents might promise gold and sanctuary to anyone willing to eliminate a particularly troublesome killer. The bonds between criminals were always fragile, always subject to the pressures of survival and self-interest. Zifron witnessed this firsthand in the city of Damascus, where he had taken refuge for several months while the immediate heat from his latest kill cooled down. He had been sharing a room above a leatherworker's shop with another man, someone who claimed to be a travelling scribe but whose calloused hands and careful eyes suggested otherwise. They had maintained a careful fiction of mutual ignorance, each pretending to believe the other's story, while both understanding perfectly well that they were fellow travellers on the same dark road. It was an arrangement that might have continued indefinitely, built as it was on mutual deception and shared necessity. But then the city guard came in the night, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who knew exactly where to look and what to expect. Zifron woke to the sound of his roommates' muffled cries as they dragged him from his sleeping mat, and through a crack in the wallboards, he watched as they bound the man's hands and hustled him into the street. Hours later, as dawn broke over the city walls, Zifron learned what his companion's capture meant for him. The guards returned, this time accompanied by a man whose expensive robes and carefully oiled beard marked him as someone of importance. They knew his name, his real name, not the false identity he had been using. They knew about the Philistine soldier, whose death had started him on this path. They knew about every kill since then, every town he had fled, every false name he had used. His roommate, facing torture and death, had bought his own freedom with Zifron's life. It was a betrayal, yes, but also a perfectly rational decision from a man with no good options. In the world of professional killers, loyalty was always secondary to survival. Zifron escaped that morning only because he had developed the paranoid habit of never sleeping deeply, of always keeping his few possessions ready for immediate flight. He slipped out through a window while the guards were still climbing the stairs, leaving behind everything except his weapons and the clothes on his back. But the lesson was clear and brutal. There was no honor among assassins, no code that protected them from each other, no brotherhood of the blade that might offer comfort in dark times. Every relationship was transactional, every alliance temporary, every moment of trust a potential death sentence. This realization marked the beginning of the third phase of Zifron's education, the one that would prove the most corrosive to whatever remained of his humanity. If he could not trust anyone, if every person he met was a potential enemy or betrayer, then he had to learn to see all human interactions as tactical exercises, all relationships as tools to be used and discarded. The merchant who hired him as a guard became not a person, but a source of information about trade routes and wealthy targets. The innkeeper who served him wine became not a host, but a potential source of intelligence about other travellers. The prostitute who shared his bed became not a companion, however temporary, but a possible spy or assassin herself. This systematic dehumanization of everyone around him was perhaps the most necessary and most damaging skill Zifron acquired. It protected him from betrayal, yes, but it also cut him off from the last vestiges of normal human connection. He began to see the world as a vast game board, with every person merely a piece to be moved or removed as circumstances required. The psychological cost was enormous. Sleep, when it came at all, brought dreams populated by faces without names, people who had been important to him once, but who now existed only as tactical considerations in half-remembered schemes. He found himself unable to recall the sound of his mother's voice or the feeling of his father's hand on his shoulder, but he could describe in perfect detail the precise angle at which to insert a blade between a man's ribs for maximum damage. The work itself, when he could find it, was never what the stories made it seem. There were no dramatic confrontations in throne rooms, no poisons slipped into goblets at royal feasts, no crossbow bolts loosed from bell towers at precisely the right moment. The reality of assassination in the ancient world was far more brutal and far more personal. Most of his targets were not kings or generals, but ordinary people who had made enemies with enough gold to pay for their removal. A merchant who had cheated the wrong customer, a priest who had discovered corruption he should have ignored, a woman whose husband wanted her inheritance but not her company. These were not the deaths that songs were written about, but they were the deaths that paid for food and shelter and the constant movement that survival required. The methods were crude but effective. A dagger in a dark alley was the most common approach, quick and quiet if done properly, though it required getting close enough to the target to smell their fear. Poison was possible but unreliable, limited by the herbs and minerals available and by the difficulty of ensuring the target consumed a fatal dose. Arranged accidents were preferred when circumstances allowed, a loose stone that might fall from a roof at just the right moment, a cartwheel that might fail on a dangerous mountain path. But every approach carried its own risks and required its own specialized knowledge. Zifron learned to study his targets for weeks or months before making his move, mapping their routines, identifying their weaknesses, planning multiple escape routes for every possible contingency. He learned which weapons left distinctive marks that might point to professional involvement and which could be mistaken for the tools of common bandits. He learned how to dispose of bodies so they would not be found quickly, how to clean blood from clothing and skin, how to walk away from a kill without leaving any trace of his involvement. The ancient world's approach to investigating mysterious deaths was haphazard at best, but it was not non-existent. Important people had friends and family who would demand answers, who would hire their own investigators or offer rewards for information. Local authorities, while not sophisticated by modern standards, were often surprisingly thorough when motivated by political pressure or personal interest. This meant that every successful assassination was followed by a period of extreme vulnerability, when Zifron had to assume that everyone he encountered might be an agent of his victim's allies, when every knock at the door might herald his capture, when every stranger's glance might indicate recognition and pursuit. The stress was constant and overwhelming. His hands developed a persistent tremor that he had to consciously control when in public. His appetite disappeared for days at a time, leaving him gaunt and hollow-eyed. Sleep became even more elusive, and when it did come, it brought nightmares so vivid and terrible that waking was often worse than the dreams themselves. But perhaps the most corrosive aspect of the work was not the killing itself, but the way it gradually stripped away every moral boundary he had once possessed. His first kill had been driven by rage and grief, emotions that, however destructive, were at least recognizably human. His subsequent kills had been matters of survival, desperate acts by a desperate man trying to stay alive in a hostile world. But as the years passed and the body count grew, the killings became purely transactional. A bag of silver changed hands, a name was whispered in a shadowy corner, a life ended in a dark street. There was no passion in it anymore, no personal investment, just the mechanical application of lethal skills to human problems. This emotional numbness was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed him to function, to do what was necessary without being paralyzed by guilt or horror. But it also meant that he was losing pieces of himself with each kill, becoming less human and more like a tool, a weapon that walked and talked but had no soul. He began to understand why the few old assassins he had encountered seemed so hollow, so absent even when they were physically present. They had not just learned to kill, they had learned to kill the parts of themselves that might object to killing. They had traded their humanity for survival, and the bargain had left them as ghosts haunting their own lives. The money, when it came, was never enough to compensate for what was lost. A successful assassination might bring enough silver to live comfortably for months, but it also brought months of looking over one's shoulder, of jumping at shadows, of wondering if every new face in a crowd belonged to an enemy. The wealthy clients who hired assassins were not generally the sort of people who honored their debts or kept their secrets, and more than one killer had found himself targeted for elimination by the very people who had once paid for his services. This created a particularly vicious cycle where each successful kill not only brought new enemies, but also made future employment more dangerous. The more skilled and notorious an assassin became, the more likely he was to be seen as a threat by potential clients, the more careful he had to be about accepting work, and the more isolated he became from the networks of information and opportunity that made survival possible. Zifron learned this lesson the hard way when a wealthy merchant in Tyre, having commissioned him to eliminate a business rival, decided that the assassin himself knew too much to be allowed to live. The ambush came 3 days after the successful completion of the contract, when Zifron was collecting the second half of his payment from what he thought was a secure location. The hired swords came at him in a narrow alley between warehouses, 3 men with the kind of scars that spoke of professional violence. They moved with coordinated precision, blocking escape routes with practiced ease. But they had made the mistake of underestimating what years of constant paranoia had done to Zifron's reflexes. He killed 2 of them before they could close the distance, his blade finding the gaps in their leather armor with the kind of muscle memory that no longer required conscious thought. The 3rd man managed to land a deep cut across his ribs before joining his companions in the dust. But as Zifron stood bleeding in that narrow alley, listening for the sound of city guards drawn by the commotion, he understood with perfect clarity that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The merchant's family would want revenge for his death. The families of the 3 assassins would want blood for blood. The city authorities would want someone to blame for the bodies piling up in their streets. And somewhere in the shadows, other professional killers would be calculating whether eliminating the increasingly notorious Zifron might be profitable enough to justify the risk. This was the trap that eventually caught every assassin who lived long enough to spring it. Success bred notoriety, notoriety bred enemies, and enemies bred the kind of attention that made survival exponentially more difficult. The ancient world was not large enough to hide from a reputation, not interconnected enough to start completely fresh, and not forgiving enough to allow retirement from a profession written in blood. Zifron bound his wounds with strips torn from a dead man's cloak and slipped out of Tyre before dawn, but he carried with him the knowledge that his options were narrowing with each passing year. The network of contacts who might offer work was shrinking as former associates died or disappeared. The number of cities where his face was not known, or his methods not whispered about, was dwindling towards 0. The web of enemies seeking his death was growing larger and more determined. And beneath all of these practical concerns lay a deeper, more existential problem. After years of living as a professional killer, Zifron was discovering that he no longer knew how to be anything else. The skills that had kept him alive, the habits of mind that had allowed him to function in a world of constant danger, had become so deeply ingrained that they could not be simply set aside. He found himself unable to trust anyone completely, unable to relax even in apparently safe situations, unable to form the kinds of bonds that might have offered an alternative path. When he tried to imagine a different life, perhaps as a caravan guard or a hired soldier, he could not envision how such work would be possible for someone whose every instinct had been shaped by years of killing in shadows. The ancient world offered few opportunities for reinvention. Unlike our modern era with its emphasis on individual choice and personal transformation, the biblical period was one where identity was largely fixed by birth, family, and community. A man was known by his father's name, his tribe's reputation, his village's history. To be cut loose from these moorings was to become something less than fully human, a creature existing on the margins of civilized society. For someone like Zifron, whose very existence was built on deception and violence, the possibility of genuine redemption seemed as distant as the stars. He was not merely a man who had done terrible things. He had become a man whose entire being was shaped by those terrible things. The boy who had once laughed at his sister's jokes and helped his father sort copper ingots might as well have been a character from someone else's dream. This psychological prison was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the assassin's life in biblical times. Physical wounds healed. Financial difficulties could be overcome. Even powerful enemies might eventually lose interest or die. But the damage done to the soul, the slow erosion of everything that made a person recognizably human, was permanent and irreversible. Zifron began to understand why some of the older killers he had encountered seemed so eager to die. It was not cowardice or despair in the conventional sense, but rather a bone-deep weariness with the burden of being themselves. They had become so thoroughly divorced from normal human experience that death seemed less like an ending and more like a release from an existence that had long since ceased to have meaning. The isolation was made worse by the fact that the work itself provided no sense of purpose or accomplishment. Unlike soldiers, who could at least tell themselves they fought for king and country, or bandits, who could claim to be striking back at an unjust world, assassins served no cause larger than their own survival. Each kill was merely a transaction, a temporary solution to the problem of staying alive long enough to find the next client. There was no glory in it, no songs sung by wandering minstrels, no tales told around fires to inspire young men to greatness. The best an assassin could hope for was to be forgotten, to have his deeds fade from memory so completely that no one would think to seek revenge for them. Fame, which other men sought as a kind of immortality, was for killers a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The religious implications weighed heavily as well. The ancient world was saturated with divine presence, where gods walked among mortals, and every action had spiritual consequences. The law of Moses was clear about the shedding of innocent blood, and while definitions of innocence might be flexible in practice, the cosmic weight of murder was understood by all. Zifron found himself haunted not just by the faces of his victims, but by questions about their eternal fate and his own. In a world where the afterlife was not a distant abstraction, but an immediate concern, where the dead were thought to linger near their burial places, and where blood called out from the ground for justice, every kill carried theological implications that extended far beyond the immediate political or economic considerations. The ancient Hebrews believed that murder polluted not just the killer, but the very land where blood was shed. Cities could be cursed for harboring murderers. Entire peoples could suffer divine wrath for failing to punish those who took life unlawfully. An assassin was not merely a criminal, but a source of spiritual contamination, someone whose very presence made the world less holy. This meant that even in communities that might tolerate thieves or adulterers or other common sinners, killers for hire were universally shunned. They could not participate in religious festivals, could not enter temples or sacred places, could not even be buried in consecrated ground. They were the walking dead, spiritually speaking, cut off from the divine presence that gave life meaning and purpose. The psychological toll of this spiritual isolation cannot be overstated. In a world where relationship with the divine was not optional but essential to human flourishing, to be cut off from that relationship was to be condemned to a kind of living death. Zifron found himself unable to pray, unable to approach altars, unable even to look upon sacred objects without feeling the weight of his accumulated sins pressing down like a physical burden. The nightmares that plagued his sleep were not merely echoes of past violence, but visions of divine judgment, dreams of standing before the throne of the Almighty, with hands stained red and no words of defense. He would wake in cold sweats, gasping for breath, feeling as though the very air around him was charged with accusation and condemnation. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the spiritual corruption was the way it seemed to feed upon itself, growing stronger with each new transgression. The first kill had required a supreme effort of will, a conscious choice to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. By the 10th, violence had become routine. By the 20th, it was simply another tool, no more morally significant than a hammer or a plough. This gradual deadening of conscience was both necessary for survival and catastrophic for the soul. Without it, no assassin could function for long. The weight of accumulated guilt would crush them, but with it came a kind of spiritual death that was perhaps worse than physical destruction, a slow transformation from human being to something else entirely. The ancient world had words for such creatures, beings that wore human form but had lost their humanity through repeated acts of evil. They were not demons in the supernatural sense, but they were no longer truly men either. They existed in a twilight realm between the living and the dead, neither fully of this world nor ready for the next. Zifron recognized this transformation happening within himself and was powerless to stop it. Each morning he woke a little more hollow, a little more disconnected from the emotions and impulses that had once defined him. The capacity for joy, for sorrow, for love, for fear was being systematically burned away by years of violence and isolation. He began to understand that this was the final and most terrible cost of his chosen profession, not death, which might at least offer the possibility of peace, but a kind of living extinction that left him walking through the world like a shadow of his former self. The boy who had wept for his murdered family was gone, replaced by something that could kill without feeling, betray without remorse, and face each new dawn with the flat indifference of a man who had forgotten what it meant to be alive. The few other assassins he encountered in his travels showed the same hollow quality, the same absent look in their eyes, as if they were all participating in some elaborate pantomime of human existence without actually being human themselves. They spoke when spoken to, ate when hungry, slept when exhausted, but there was no spark of genuine life in any of it, no sense that they were doing anything more than going through the motions of being alive. This was the true horror of the assassin's existence in biblical times. Not the constant danger, or the grinding poverty, or even the certainty of eventual violent death. It was the slow, inexorable loss of everything that made life worth living. The gradual transformation from person to weapon to ghost. By the time most killers realized what was happening to them, the process was already irreversible, and they were left to face the remaining years of their existence as hollow shells of their former selves. And yet, somehow, they continued. Not from hope, for hope required the capacity to imagine a better future, and that capacity had long since been stripped away. Not from fear, for fear required caring about the outcome, and caring was a luxury they could no longer afford. They continued from pure momentum, from the biological imperative to survive, from the grim determination to keep moving forward even when forward led nowhere worth going. This was what it truly meant to be an assassin in the world of the Old Testament. To trade not just one's safety or one's reputation, but one's very humanity for the cold comfort of professional competence. It was a bargain that seemed reasonable in the moment of desperation that usually preceded it, but whose true cost only became clear when it was far too late to reconsider the terms. The ancient world was full of such bargains, transactions where the price was not fully understood until after payment had been made. But few were as comprehensive in their destruction as the choice to make one's living in the shadows, killing for coin and counting the cost only when there was nothing left to count. The winters were perhaps the cruelest season of all for men like Zifron. While honest folk huddled around their hearths with family and friends, sharing warmth and stories and the simple comfort of human companionship, assassins faced the cold months alone. There was no steady work in winter. The mountain passes filled with snow, making travel treacherous and limiting the movement of merchants and pilgrims who might serve as cover for clandestine activities. The shortened days left fewer hours of darkness for covert operations, and the clear, cold air carried sounds farther than usual, making stealth more difficult. Most importantly, the wealthy and powerful who constituted the primary market for assassination services were typically well guarded in their winter residences, surrounded by loyal retainers and protected by walls that were harder to breach when every footprint in the snow left a trail pointing directly back to its maker. Zifron learned to dread the onset of winter, not just for the physical hardships it brought, but for the long months of enforced idleness that gave him nothing to do but remember. In the busy seasons, when contracts were plentiful and travel was possible, he could lose himself in the mechanics of his profession. There were routes to plan, targets to study, weapons to maintain, disguises to perfect. The constant activity of survival could, for brief periods, distract him from the deeper questions of what he had become and what he had lost. But winter stripped away all such distractions, leaving him alone with his thoughts in whatever miserable shelter he had managed to secure. A cave in the wilderness, if he was lucky. A rented corner of a stable if he had coin. An abandoned building if he could find one that wasn't already occupied by other desperate souls. The accommodations mattered little, because the real prison was inside his own mind. He would lie awake through the long nights, listening to the wind howl through cracks in stone or timber, and find himself cataloguing his sins like a merchant counting inventory. The Philistine soldier who had started it all, still so vivid in memory that Zifron could recall the exact pattern of scars on the man's forearms. The merchant's guard who had died for the crime of being alert at the wrong moment. The bandit whose throat he had opened to prevent the man from raising an alarm that would have brought others running. Each face rose unbidden from the depths of memory, and with each face came questions that had no comfortable answers. Had the Philistine soldier been a father? Did children somewhere still wait for his return, growing older each year without understanding why their father had never come home from the war? The merchant's guard had worn a simple bronze ring on his left hand, the kind that married men favoured. Was there a widow somewhere who still set out 2 bowls at the evening meal out of habit, only to remember with fresh grief that one of them would never again be filled? These midnight inventories were torturous, but they served a purpose that Zifron was only beginning to understand. The capacity to feel guilt, to experience remorse, to be haunted by the consequences of one's actions, was perhaps the last thread connecting him to his abandoned humanity. As long as the faces of the dead could still disturb his sleep, as long as he could still imagine the ripples of suffering that spread outward from each life he had taken, he remained something more than a mere killing implement. He had encountered other assassins who claimed they never thought about their victims, who insisted that dwelling on the past was a luxury that professionals in their line of work could not afford. But Zifron had looked into their eyes and seen something that frightened him more than any threat of physical violence. They had achieved the emotional numbness that the profession seemed to demand, but in doing so, they had become something less than human, walking corpses animated by nothing more than basic animal instincts. The prospect of following that same path terrified him in ways that daggers and poison and pursuit by vengeful enemies never could. To lose the capacity for guilt would be to lose the last vestige of the boy he had once been, the final connection to the world of normal human feeling that he had abandoned but not entirely forgotten. And yet, with each passing season, each new contract, each additional name added to his growing list of victims, he could feel that capacity diminishing like a flame, slowly consuming its fuel. The religious festivals were particularly difficult times. Even in his exile from normal society, Zifron could not entirely escape the rhythms of the sacred calendar that governed life throughout the ancient Near East. The sound of temple bells carried on the wind, the smoke of sacrificial fires rose from every city and town, and the roads filled with pilgrims traveling to celebrate the appointed times with their families and communities. During these periods, his isolation became almost unbearable. He would sometimes find himself following groups of pilgrims at a distance, close enough to hear their songs and laughter, but far enough away to avoid detection. There was something about the sound of children's voices raised in praise, about the sight of fathers carrying their sons on their shoulders, about the gentle way elderly couples helped each other along difficult stretches of road, that made his chest tighten with a longing so profound it felt like physical pain. These were the moments when the full weight of what he had sacrificed became clear. It was not just comfort or safety or respectability that he had traded away, but belonging itself. The right to be part of something larger than his own survival, to contribute to the great human project of civilization, to pass on wisdom and love and hope to the next generation. He had placed himself outside the community of mankind, and there was no path back. The law was clear on this point, and Zifron had grown up hearing it recited in the synagogues of his youth. Those who shed innocent blood were cut off from the congregation of the righteous, banned from participating in the sacred rituals that bound the community together, condemned to wander as outcasts until their deaths. There was provision for repentance and restitution in many cases, but not for those whose crimes were too numerous and too heinous to be forgiven by earthly authority. This spiritual dimension of his exile was perhaps the most devastating aspect of all. In a world where relationship with the divine was understood to be the foundation of all human flourishing, to be cut off from that relationship was to be condemned to a kind of living death. The temples that dotted every city were not merely buildings, but gateways to the sacred, places where heaven and earth touched and where mortals could approach the divine presence with their petitions and praise. Zifron found himself unable to enter such places, not because of any physical barrier, but because the weight of his accumulated sins seemed to press down upon him like a crushing burden whenever he approached sacred ground. The few times he had attempted to slip into the back of a synagogue during evening prayers, he had been overwhelmed by a suffocating sense of his own unworthiness, a conviction that his presence was polluting the very air that holy men breathed. The ancient world made no distinction between ritual purity and moral purity in the way that modern minds might. To be spiritually unclean was to be physically dangerous to others, a source of contamination that could spread through communities like a plague. A murderer was not merely someone who had broken a law, but someone whose very existence threatened the cosmic order that kept chaos at bay. This understanding shaped every aspect of how society treated professional killers. They were not merely criminals to be punished, but sources of pollution to be avoided. Walking violations of the natural order that had to be kept separate from decent people, lest their corruption spread. Even those who might have been inclined to show mercy or offer assistance were constrained by the belief that helping a murderer was itself a form of participation in his crimes. The practical consequences of this spiritual exile were severe. Zifron found himself barred not just from religious observances, but from most forms of legitimate commerce and social interaction. Honest merchants would not trade with him if they knew his profession. Innkeepers would not rent him rooms. Even prostitutes would sometimes refuse his coin out of fear that association with him would bring divine wrath upon their heads. This forced him to develop an entirely parallel economy of relationships with others who existed on the margins of society. smugglers and bandits, corrupt officials and dishonest merchants, the desperate and the damned who had their own reasons for avoiding the attention of legitimate authority. It was a shadow world that operated according to its own rules, where trust was always temporary and betrayal was simply another form of commerce. But even within this underground community, assassins occupied a special position of isolation. While thieves might band together for mutual protection and smugglers might form lasting partnerships based on shared routes and contacts, killers remained fundamentally alone. The nature of their work made long-term associations too dangerous, and the psychological toll of their profession made genuine friendship nearly impossible. Zifron learned to recognize others in his trade by subtle signs that would be invisible to normal observers. The way they held themselves slightly apart, even in crowds, the careful neutrality of their expressions, the habit of sitting with their backs to walls and their hands near their weapons. They might nod to each other in passing, might even share information about which routes were safe and which cities to avoid, but they never truly relaxed in each other's company. This wariness was born from bitter experience. In a profession where survival often depended on eliminating potential threats, every colleague was also a potential enemy. The ancient world's approach to law enforcement frequently involved turning criminals against each other, offering pardons and rewards to those willing to betray their associates. More than one assassin had found himself targeted for elimination by someone he had considered a friend, either for the bounty on his head or simply to remove a witness to past crimes. The few times Zifron had attempted to work with partners, the arrangements had ended badly. There was the Egyptian who had tried to poison him after a successful joint contract, apparently calculating that a dead partner meant no need to share the payment. The Phoenician who had attempted to sell information about Zifron's methods to a rival assassin, viewing it as simply another form of merchandise. The young Greek who had panicked during what should have been a routine elimination and whose screams had brought guards running, forcing Zifron to kill him to prevent capture. Each betrayal reinforced the fundamental lesson of his profession. Trust no one. Depend on no one. Allow no one close enough to do serious harm. It was a philosophy that ensured survival but guaranteed loneliness, a bargain that traded human connection for professional longevity. The cost seemed reasonable when viewed through the lens of immediate necessity, but the accumulated weight of decades of isolation could crush a man's spirit as surely as any physical torture. The aging process was particularly cruel for professional killers. While other men could look forward to their later years as a time of reduced responsibility and increased respect, when their accumulated wisdom would be valued and their past accomplishments celebrated, assassins faced only declining capabilities and increasing vulnerability. The steady hand that had once been able to place a blade with surgical precision would develop tremors. The sharp eyes that had once been able to spot danger from across a crowded marketplace would grow dim. The quick reflexes that had meant the difference between life and death in countless confrontations would slow until they were no longer reliable. But worse than physical decline was the knowledge that there would be no peaceful retirement, no comfortable old age surrounded by grateful children and grandchildren. The enemies accumulated over decades of professional killing did not simply forget their grievances or abandon their desire for revenge. If anything, the passage of time often intensified their hatred, as sons inherited the obligation to avenge their fathers, and entire clans nursed grudges across generations. Zifron had seen what happened to assassins who lived long enough to lose their edge. They became prey instead of predators, hunted by younger, stronger killers who saw them as easy targets, or by enemies who finally sensed weakness after years of waiting for the right moment to strike. The lucky ones died quickly in their sleep or in brief, decisive confrontations that left no time for fear or regret. The unlucky ones were captured alive and subjected to the kind of prolonged, creative torture that their victims' families had been planning for years. There was no pension system for retired killers, no guild or organization that looked after its members in their declining years. The gold and silver that a successful assassin might accumulate over his career was useful only as long as he remained capable of protecting it. Wealth without the ability to defend it was simply an invitation for others to take it. And the ancient world was full of people who would happily murder a defenseless old man for a fraction of what a professional killer might have saved. This knowledge cast a shadow over every successful contract, every bag of coins earned, every moment of relative safety. Zifron found himself unable to enjoy even temporary prosperity because he knew how fleeting it would be, how quickly circumstances could change to transform him from hunter to hunted. The future stretched ahead like a narrowing tunnel, each year bringing him closer to the moment when his skills would no longer be sufficient to keep him alive. The psychological pressure of this inevitable decline was almost worse than the physical dangers of the work itself. At least when facing an armed opponent or planning a dangerous infiltration, there were actions he could take, skills he could employ, variables he could control. But the steady erosion of time was beyond any human power to stop or slow. And the knowledge that each passing season brought him closer to helplessness was a constant source of anxiety. Some assassins tried to forestall this fate by training protégés, passing on their skills to younger men who might offer protection in exchange for knowledge. But these arrangements were notoriously unstable, built as they were on the inherent untrustworthiness that the profession demanded. More often than not, the student would eventually decide that the teacher had become a liability, and the arrangement would end with another body in another dark alley. Others attempted to accumulate enough wealth to buy their way into legitimate society, using gold to purchase respectability and hoping that new identities might protect them from old enemies. But the ancient world was not a place where reinvention was easy or safe. Communities were small and interconnected. Strangers were noticed and remembered. And there were always those who specialized in uncovering secrets for the right price. Zifron had watched several attempts at such transformations, and none had ended well. The former assassin who tried to establish himself as a merchant in Damascus was recognized by a former target's brother within months of setting up shop. The killer who attempted to disappear into a religious community was betrayed by his own nightmares, screaming out details of past crimes in his sleep, until the other monks realized what kind of man they had welcomed into their midst. The fundamental problem was that the skills and habits that made a good assassin were antithetical to the requirements of normal social life. The hypervigilance that kept killers alive made them seem paranoid and unstable to ordinary people. The emotional numbness that allowed them to function professionally made genuine human connections impossible. The deceptive abilities that were essential for infiltrating targets' environments made them inherently untrustworthy as friends or business partners. Even the physical markers of the profession were difficult to hide. The calluses on hands accustomed to gripping weapons, the scars from old wounds, the unconscious way of moving that spoke of violence and danger. Experienced observers could identify a professional killer as easily as they might recognize a blacksmith or a scribe. And in a world where such men were universally feared and despised, recognition was often equivalent to a death sentence. The isolation was made worse by the fact that the work itself provided no sense of community or shared purpose. Unlike soldiers, who could at least bond with their comrades in arms and take pride in serving a larger cause, assassins worked alone and served only their own survival. Unlike craftsmen, who could point to the objects they had created and know that their skills contributed something positive to the world, killers left behind only death and sorrow. There were no songs celebrating the deeds of assassins, no monuments erected in their honor, no festivals commemorating their achievements. The best a professional killer could hope for was to be forgotten entirely, to have his crimes fade from memory so completely that no one would think to seek revenge for them. Fame, which other men pursued as a form of immortality, was for assassins a burden that made survival exponentially more difficult. The ancient world's understanding of honor and shame was particularly cruel to those in Zifrin's profession. Honor was not merely personal reputation, but a kind of spiritual currency that determined one's place in the cosmic order. To be honorable was to be aligned with the forces of light and righteousness. To be shameful was to be allied with darkness and chaos. There was no middle ground, no neutral territory where a man might exist without being judged according to these absolute standards. An assassin was, by definition, without honor, not merely because of his specific crimes, but because of the fundamental nature of his profession. To kill for money was to reduce the most sacred act, the taking of human life, to a mere commercial transaction. It was to treat the divine spark that animated every person as a commodity to be bought and sold like grain or cattle or bronze. This spiritual dimension of shame was perhaps more devastating than any physical consequence. In a world where one's relationship with the divine was understood to be the foundation of all meaning and purpose, to be cut off from that relationship was to be condemned to a kind of existential emptiness that no amount of material success could fill. The gold that an assassin earned for his work was blood money in the most literal sense, tainted by its association with murder and incapable of purchasing anything that really mattered. The ancient texts were full of warnings about such wealth, describing how it corrupted everything it touched and brought curses upon those who possessed it. Whether or not one believed in the literal truth of such pronouncements, the psychological effect was undeniable. Every coin in an assassin's purse was a reminder of the life that had been taken to earn it. Every meal purchased with such money tasted of death. Every night's shelter bought with blood seemed haunted by the ghosts of the murdered. This spiritual weight accumulated over time like physical poison, gradually destroying not just the killer's relationship with the divine, but his capacity for any form of transcendent meaning or purpose. The simple pleasures that made life bearable for ordinary people. The joy found in beauty or love or achievement became increasingly inaccessible as the soul grew more corrupted by its repeated exposure to violence and death. Zifron found himself losing the ability to appreciate things that had once moved him deeply. The sight of sunrise over distant mountains, the sound of children laughing in marketplace squares, the taste of fresh bread or good wine. All of these began to fade into a grey uniformity of sensation. It was as if his capacity for genuine feeling was being systematically burned away by the acid of accumulated guilt and shame. The nightmares that plagued his sleep grew more vivid and more frequent as the years passed, until the boundary between dreams and waking consciousness began to blur. He would find himself starting awake with a dagger in his hand, heart pounding with the certainty that enemies were approaching, only to realize that the sounds he had heard were nothing more than wind in the trees or the settling of old timbers. These episodes left him exhausted and disoriented, unsure of what was real and what was the product of a mind slowly coming apart under the pressure of too many secrets and too much solitude. The ancient world had no understanding of what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress or anxiety disorders. But it did understand that prolonged exposure to violence and death could drive men mad, turning them into something less than human and more dangerous than wild beasts. The few physicians who might have been willing to treat such conditions were generally unwilling to risk association with professional killers, and even if treatment had been available, the underlying causes could not be addressed without abandoning the profession that had created them. An assassin could not simply stop being an assassin, any more than a man could stop being haunted by the ghosts of those he had murdered. This was the trap that eventually caught everyone who chose Zifrin's path. The realization that the profession was not something one did, but something one became. The skills and habits and psychological adaptations that made killing possible were not tools that could be picked up and set down at will, but permanent alterations to the fundamental structure of personality and soul. Once a man had crossed the line into professional murder, there was no crossing back, no return to innocence or normalcy or peace. The ancient world understood this in ways that our modern age, with its faith in rehabilitation and second chances, sometimes struggles to grasp. Some choices were irreversible. Some paths led to places from which there was no return. Some bargains could not be undone, no matter how much the buyer might eventually regret the purchase. To become an assassin was to trade one's humanity for survival, and it was a transaction that left both parties permanently changed. The weight of this understanding settled over Zifron like a burial shroud as he huddled in yet another abandoned shepherd's hut, waiting out a winter storm that had trapped him in the hills above Hebron. The wind howled through gaps in the stone walls, with a sound that reminded him uncomfortably of the dying breaths of men whose names he had forgotten, but whose faces still visited him in dreams. He had been walking this dark path for nearly 2 decades now, and the boy who had once wept over his family's graves had become something that would have terrified that same boy beyond measure. The transformation had been so gradual, so incremental, that he had barely noticed it happening. Each small compromise, each tiny surrender of principle, each moment when survival had demanded he set aside another piece of his conscience had seemed reasonable at the time, but now, in the howling darkness of this winter night, he could see the full scope of what he had become with a clarity that was almost unbearable. He was no longer a man who killed, but a killer who wore the shape of a man. The distinction might seem academic to an outside observer, but to Zifron it represented the difference between damnation and mere sin, between a soul that might still be redeemed and one that had passed beyond any hope of salvation. The ancient world had words for creatures like him, beings that had once been human, but had surrendered their humanity so completely that they existed in a twilight realm between the living and the dead. They were not demons in the supernatural sense, for demons at least served some cosmic purpose in the great struggle between light and darkness. They were something worse, voids in the shape of men, walking absences that consumed light and hope wherever they went. The religious implications of this transformation weighed on him more heavily than any physical burden he had ever carried. In his youth, before the raiders had come and destroyed everything he held dear, Zifron had been raised in the traditions of his people, taught to revere the law and to understand his place in the great covenant that bound the children of Abraham to their God. He had memorized the sacred texts, participated in the festivals, offered the prescribed sacrifices with a heart full of genuine devotion. Now the very words of those ancient prayers seemed to burn his tongue when he tried to speak them. The few times he had attempted to approach a shrine or holy place, the weight of his accumulated sins had pressed down upon him like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe and impossible to proceed. It was as if the divine presence itself recoiled from contact with something as corrupted as he had become. The law was explicit about the fate of those who shed innocent blood. They were to be cut off from the community of the faithful, banned from participating in the sacred rituals that bound society together, condemned to wander as outcasts until death claimed them. But even death might not bring peace, for the ancient texts spoke of different fates awaiting the righteous and the wicked in whatever realm lay beyond the grave. Zifron had grown up hearing the stories of men who had found redemption, even after committing terrible crimes. Moses himself had been a murderer before he became the great lawgiver. David had arranged the death of Uriah to cover his own adultery, yet he remained beloved of God. The scriptures were full of examples of divine mercy extending even to those who seemed beyond hope. But those men had committed their crimes in passion, in moments of weakness or desperation. They had never made murder their profession, never reduced the taking of human life to a cold calculation of risk and reward. They had killed and repented, not killed and killed again, until the act became as natural as breathing. This was the crucial distinction that made redemption impossible for men like Zifron. It was not the number of his victims that placed him beyond forgiveness, though that number had grown disturbingly large over the years. It was the systematic nature of his crimes, the deliberate choice to make violence his way of life, the calculated surrender of everything that made him human in exchange for the ability to survive in a world that had no place for him, The ancient understanding of sin was not merely about individual acts, but about the fundamental orientation of the soul. A man who killed in anger might be forgiven, for anger was a human emotion that could be purified and redirected. A man who killed for gain might find mercy, for greed was a common weakness that could be overcome through discipline and right teaching. But a man who killed because killing had become his nature, who could take life without feeling anything at all, had moved beyond the realm where human mercy or divine forgiveness could reach. This theological dimension of his exile was perhaps the most devastating aspect of all, for it meant that the isolation he experienced was not merely social, but cosmic. He was cut off not only from human community, but from the very source of meaning and purpose that gave existence its significance. In a world where relationship with the divine was understood to be the foundation of all human flourishing, to be severed from that relationship was to be condemned to a kind of spiritual death that was worse than physical destruction. The winter nights were the worst, when the darkness stretched endlessly and there was nothing to do but remember. Zifron would lie on whatever makeshift bed he had managed to arrange, staring up at ceiling beams or cave walls or star-filled skies, and find his mind cataloguing the dead with the methodical precision of a scribe tallying grain stores. There had been so many over the years that individual faces began to blur together into a kind of composite image of death. The young ones bothered him more than the old, perhaps because they reminded him of what he had been before the world had taught him, that innocence was a luxury he could not afford. The women were harder to forget than the men, not because their deaths had been any more or less justified, but because the ancient world's understanding of gender roles made female targets relatively rare and therefore more memorable. He remembered the merchant's daughter in Sidon, barely 16, and already married to a man 3 times her age, whose business rivals had decided that eliminating her would be more cost-effective than competing honestly. She had been gathering herbs in her garden when Zifron approached, humming softly to herself in the way that young people did when they believed themselves alone and unobserved. The knife had found its mark with practiced efficiency, but her song had continued for several seconds after the blade pierced her heart, trailing off into silence like a bird's call fading at sunset. There had been the priest in Jericho who had discovered that the temple funds were being diverted to finance a rebellion against the local governor. His crime had been honesty, in a world where dishonesty was not only profitable but politically necessary. Zifron had found him at his evening prayers, kneeling before the altar with his hands raised toward heaven, and for a moment had hesitated. There was something about the man's posture, the genuine devotion in his whispered words, that had awakened echoes of the faith Zifron had once possessed. But hesitation was a luxury that professional killers could not afford, and the blade had completed its work with the same efficiency that marked all of Zifron's professional endeavors. The priest had died without knowing what struck him, slumping forward onto the altar stones with his prayers still on his lips. Zifron had left him there, arranged as if he had simply fallen asleep during his devotions, and it had been hours before anyone discovered that sleep had become something far more permanent. The irony was not lost on him that he had become more efficient at ending prayers than most men were at offering them. His hands, which had once been raised in worship alongside his family in the synagogue of his youth, were now instruments of violence that could silence songs of praise with surgical precision. The transformation was complete and irreversible, a perversion of human purpose that would have been comic if it had not been so utterly tragic. Each death had brought its own set of complications, its own network of consequences that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The merchant's daughter had been beloved by her servants, who had pooled their meager savings to hire investigators to find her killer. The priest had been respected by his congregation, who had convinced the temple hierarchy to offer substantial rewards for information about his murder. Every contract completed successfully created new enemies, new hunters, new reasons to keep moving and never stay in one place long enough to feel safe. The pursuit was relentless and increasingly sophisticated, as word of his activities spread through the interconnected networks of trade and politics, that bound the ancient world together. What had begun as simple revenge-seeking by individual families had evolved into something approaching organized law enforcement, with professional bounty hunters and private investigators joining the ranks of those who sought his capture or death. These men were dangerous in ways that grieving relatives were not, for they brought to the hunt the same cold professionalism that Zifron himself employed in his work. They understood his methods, could anticipate his movements, knew how to set traps that might snare even someone with his experience and paranoia. Several times over the years, he had narrowly escaped such carefully laid ambushes, and each time the margin of safety had grown narrower. The most frightening encounter had come in Damascus, where he had been staying in a rented room above a leather worker's shop while waiting for a client to make contact. He had awakened in the depths of night with the certain knowledge that something was wrong, though he could not immediately identify what had triggered his alarm. The sounds from the street below were normal for the hour. The air held no unusual scents, and yet every instinct screamed danger. Moving with the careful silence that had kept him alive through countless similar situations, Zifron had slipped to the window and peered down into the narrow alley that ran behind the building. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar collection of refuse bins and sleeping beggars that characterized such places throughout the ancient world. But then a shadow moved where shadows should have been still, and he caught a glimpse of metal reflecting starlight. The building was surrounded by at least a dozen men, professionals by their movements and positioning, armed and armored, and clearly prepared for a long siege if necessary. Escape through the normal routes was impossible, but years of experience had taught Zifron never to rely on normal routes. The leather worker's shop below dealt in hides and tanning chemicals, substances that were both valuable and dangerous enough to require special storage arrangements. The building's roof was connected to a complex system of drainage channels designed to carry away the toxic runoff from the tanning process. And these channels led to a covered sewer that emptied into the river beyond the city walls. It was not a pleasant means of escape, but it was one that his pursuers had not anticipated. By the time they grew tired of waiting and stormed his room, Zifron was already miles away, following the river toward distant hills and temporary safety. But the incident had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The hunters were learning, adapting their methods to counter his usual tactics. The network of those seeking his death was growing more sophisticated and better funded with each passing year. Most disturbing of all, they had demonstrated the ability to track him even when he thought he had covered his trail completely. This suggested that his enemies now included people with access to resources and information networks that rivaled those of kings and high priests. Perhaps they were kings and high priests, men whose wealth and power had been threatened by his activities and who could afford to hire the best investigators and bounty hunters in the known world. The thought was deeply unsettling, for it meant that there might be no corner of the earth remote enough to hide him, no identity false enough to protect him, no amount of caution sufficient to ensure his safety. The psychological pressure of this escalating pursuit was beginning to take its toll in ways that went beyond simple paranoia. Zifron found himself unable to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time, starting awake at every small sound, with his hand already reaching for his weapon. His appetite disappeared almost entirely, leaving him gaunt and hollow-eyed, surviving on whatever scraps he could force himself to swallow when hunger became too painful to ignore. Worse still was the way his mind began to turn against itself, creating threats where none existed and seeing enemies in every face he encountered. The line between rational caution and delusional paranoia grew increasingly blurred as exhaustion and stress wore away at his mental defenses. He would spend hours studying the movements of innocent merchants and pilgrims, convinced that their ordinary activities were part of some elaborate surveillance operation designed to track his whereabouts. This deterioration of his mental state was perhaps the most dangerous development of all, for it threatened to rob him of the clear judgment that had kept him alive through 2 decades of professional killing. An assassin who could not trust his own perceptions was as good as dead, and Zifron could feel that crucial ability slipping away like sand through his fingers. The ancient world had no understanding of what modern medicine would recognize as psychological breakdown or nervous exhaustion. But it did understand that prolonged exposure to violence and stress could drive men mad. The symptoms were well documented in the accounts of soldiers who had survived too many battles and seen too much death. They became jumpy and unpredictable, unable to distinguish between real threats and imaginary ones, dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. Such men were typically isolated from normal society, not out of cruelty, but from recognition that they had been damaged in ways that made them unsuitable for ordinary human interaction. They might be cared for by their families if they were fortunate, or left to wander as beggars if they were not, but they were never again trusted with weapons or responsibilities that might put others at risk. For someone like Zifron, whose survival depended entirely on his ability to function as a professional killer, the prospect of such mental deterioration was more terrifying than any physical threat he had ever faced. Without his skills, without his judgment, without his capacity to assess and respond to danger appropriately, he would become just another broken man, stumbling through a world that had no use for him. The irony was that the very success that had made him a target was also destroying his ability to defend himself against that targeting. Each contract completed, each enemy eliminated, each bag of gold earned had brought him closer to the psychological breaking point that would render all his accumulated wealth and experience worthless. He was being consumed by his own competence, destroyed by the very abilities that had once seemed like his salvation. This understanding came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over distant mountains, as he crouched in that freezing shepherd's hut and listened to the wind howl through the darkness. He had thought himself the hunter, the predator, the master of his own fate. But in truth, he had been the prey all along, stalked not by human enemies, but by the inexorable consequences of his own choices, pursued by forces that no amount of skill or cunning could ultimately evade. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it brought a strange kind of peace. For the first time in years, Zifron could see his situation with perfect clarity, stripped of the illusions and self-deceptions that had sustained him through the endless cycle of killing and running and killing again. He was a dead man walking, had been for years without realizing it. The only question now was whether his death would come at the hands of his enemies, from the collapse of his own sanity or from some other cause entirely. But perhaps, in this final clarity, there might still be room for choice. Not the choice to escape the consequences of what he had done, for those consequences were as fixed as the movements of the stars, but the choice of how to meet whatever fate awaited him, whether with the dignity that his victims had been denied, or with the same cold efficiency that had characterized his professional life. The storm outside was beginning to subside, and through gaps in the clouds he could see the first pale hints of dawn touching the eastern horizon. Soon he would have to leave this temporary shelter and continue the journey that could only end in one way. But for now, in these last quiet moments before the final chase began, Zifron allowed himself to remember not the faces of the dead, but the face of the boy he had once been, and to whisper a prayer that someone, somewhere, might still remember that boy with kindness. The ancient world was preparing to wake, and with it would come all the dangers and pursuits and consequences that he had spent so many years trying to outrun. But tonight, at least, he could rest in the knowledge that the long pretense was finally over, and that whatever came next, it would be faced by a man who had at last stopped lying to himself about what he had become. The wind had died to a whisper by the time Zifron stirred from his makeshift bed, but the cold had settled deeper, seeping through stone and wool and skin until it felt like it had taken residence in his very bones. He rose slowly, joints protesting after too many nights on hard ground, and began the familiar ritual of preparation that had governed his mornings for more years than he cared to count. His weapons came first, always first. The bronze dagger with its worn leather grip, polished until it gleamed despite its age. The smaller blade hidden in his boot, narrow and sharp enough to slip between ribs with minimal resistance. The garroting wire wrapped around his forearm beneath his sleeve, invisible to casual observation but ready to be deployed in seconds. Each tool was checked, tested, returned to its proper place with the methodical precision of a priest performing sacred rites. But as Zifron went through these motions, he found himself thinking not of the weapons themselves, but of the hands that wielded them. When had they become so steady, so sure in their deadly work? When had the tremor of conscience that had once made them shake been replaced by this cold competence? He flexed his fingers, studying the calluses and scars that marked them as surely as any brand might mark a slave's forehead. These were not the hands of the boy who had once helped his father sort copper ingots by weight and purity. They were not the hands that had braided his sister's hair or carved wooden toys for the neighbor's children. They had become something else entirely. Instruments shaped by violence and refined by repetition, until they could end a life with the same casual efficiency that a scribe's hands might form letters on papyrus. The transformation was complete in ways that went far beyond the merely physical. Zifron had trained his body to move without sound, to strike without warning, to kill without hesitation. But the real change had been deeper, in places that bronze and leather could never reach. His soul had been reshaped by decades of professional murder until it bore no resemblance to anything that might once have been called human. He could remember, dimly, a time when taking life had required an act of will, a conscious decision to cross a line that should never be crossed. Now it was simply another skill, no different from reading tracks in dust or picking a lock in darkness. The moral weight that should have accompanied such acts had been worn away by repetition and necessity until nothing remained but cold technique. This was what the ancient world understood about certain kinds of corruption, that they were not merely additive, but transformative. A man did not simply accumulate sins like a merchant might accumulate debts. Some transgressions changed the very nature of the transgressor, rewriting the fundamental code that governed thought and action and desire. Murder was foremost among these transformative sins, particularly murder committed not in passion, but as profession. The religious texts were explicit on this point, though Zifron had not understood their true meaning until it was far too late to heed their warnings. To shed innocent blood was not merely to break a commandment, but to break something essential within oneself. Each death carved away another piece of whatever divine spark animated human souls, until what remained was no longer truly human at all. In the grey light filtering through the hut's single window, Zephyrin caught sight of his reflection in a puddle of rainwater that had collected in a depression in the stone floor. The face that stared back at him was lean and weathered, marked by the kind of premature aging that came from too many sleepless nights and too much constant stress. But it was the eyes that disturbed him most, flat and empty as polished stones, devoid of anything that might once have been called warmth or compassion or hope. He had seen those same eyes in the faces of other long-term survivors of his profession, the few who had managed to avoid death or capture long enough to grow old in their terrible trade. They all shared that particular quality of emptiness, as if the repeated act of taking life had gradually drained away their own capacity for living. They moved through the world like ghosts haunting their own existence, present in body, but absent in every way that truly mattered. The irony was that this emptiness, this systematic evacuation of human feeling, was both the thing that made long-term survival possible and the thing that made such survival meaningless. A man who could feel guilt, remorse, or horror at his actions would be crippled by the weight of accumulated crimes. But a man who felt nothing at all had ceased to be a man in any sense that the ancient world recognized. Zifron pulled his cloak tighter against the morning chill and stepped outside the hut, scanning the horizon with eyes that automatically catalogued potential threats and escape routes. The hills stretched away in all directions, brown and barren beneath a sky the colour of old bronze. Somewhere out there, he knew, his pursuers were already moving, following trails both fresh and ancient, drawing the net ever tighter around their quarry. But for the first time in decades, the knowledge brought him no particular anxiety. The fear that had driven him for so many years seemed to have burned itself out during the long night of self-examination, leaving behind something that was not quite peace, but was at least a form of resignation. He was what he was, had done what he had done, and would face whatever consequences awaited with the same methodical precision that had characterized his professional work. The ancient world had a word for this state of mind, though it was usually applied to warriors facing hopeless battles rather than assassins contemplating their own destruction. They called it ataraxia, a kind of calm acceptance that came not from hope, but from the complete abandonment of hope. It was the serenity of the condemned man who had stopped struggling against his bonds, the peace that came from finally acknowledging that some situations had no solutions. As Zifron began walking down the slope toward the valley road, he found himself thinking about the nature of choice in a world governed by divine will and human consequence. The philosophers of Greece and Egypt had debated such questions for centuries, arguing about whether men were truly free to shape their destinies, or whether all actions were predetermined by forces beyond mortal comprehension. In his youth, raised on the teachings of Moses and the prophets, Zifron had believed firmly in human responsibility and divine justice. Every man was free to choose between good and evil, and every choice carried consequences that extended far beyond the individual actor. The righteous would be rewarded, the wicked punished, and the great scales of cosmic justice would eventually balance all accounts. But decades of living outside the boundaries of civilized society had taught him that the reality was far more complex and far more cruel than the simple moral equations he had learned as a child. Good men died young, while evil ones prospered. The innocent suffered, while the guilty escaped unpunished. Justice, if it existed at all, operated according to principles that bore no resemblance to human notions of fairness or proportion. Perhaps this was why the ancient texts spoke so often of divine mystery, of the incomprehensible nature of heavenly wisdom. The mind of man was too small to grasp the full scope of cosmic purpose, too limited to understand how individual tragedies fit into the larger pattern of creation. What seemed like random cruelty from a human perspective might serve some greater design that would only become clear when viewed from the perspective of eternity. The thought offered little comfort, but it did provide a framework for understanding his own situation. Perhaps his transformation from innocent boy to professional killer had been part of some larger plan, a necessary element in a story whose ending had been written before the foundation of the world. Perhaps every life he had taken, every moral boundary he had crossed, every piece of his humanity he had surrendered, had served some purpose that would only become apparent when the final accounting was made. It was a seductive notion, this idea that even the worst human actions might somehow serve divine ends. It offered the possibility of meaning where there had been only emptiness, purpose where there had been only survival, redemption where there had been only damnation. But Zifron was too experienced in the art of self-deception to fall into such a comfortable trap. The truth was simpler and more terrible than any theological explanation could make it. He had made his choices freely, driven not by cosmic necessity, but by fear and anger and the simple human desire to continue existing. Every death he had caused had been the result of a decision, conscious and deliberate, to value his own survival above the lives of others. There had been no divine compulsion, no irresistible fate, only a series of moments when he had chosen the easy path over the right one. This understanding brought with it a kind of terrible clarity, the recognition that responsibility could not be shifted to gods or circumstances or the cruel nature of the world itself. He was what he had chosen to become, and the weight of that choice would remain with him until the end of his days, however few those might be. The road he had reached was little more than a dirt track, worn smooth by generations of travellers, but too narrow and remote to carry much traffic. In the distance, he could see a small caravan approaching from the south, perhaps a dozen camels laden with goods and accompanied by guards on horseback. Under normal circumstances, such a sight would have triggered an automatic assessment of potential threats and opportunities. But today, Zifron felt only a mild curiosity about where they might be bound and what they carried. As the caravan drew closer, he could make out more details. The goods appeared to be textiles and spices, luxury items bound for the markets of Damascus or Antioch. The guards were well armed but relaxed, suggesting they had encountered no trouble on their journey thus far. The merchant who led them was a fat, prosperous-looking man, whose expensive robes and well-fed appearance spoke of successful ventures and profitable connections. In the old days, such a target would have represented opportunity. A wealthy merchant, travelling a remote road with only a handful of guards to protect him, was exactly the kind of mark that Zifron might once have followed for days, studying routines and weaknesses until he could strike with maximum effect and minimal risk. The man's purse would be heavy with gold, his goods valuable enough to fence in any number of distant markets. But as the caravan passed, raising a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a brown fog, Zifron felt no stirring of predatory interest. The old instincts were still there, buried deep in muscle memory and trained reflex, but they seemed muted now, like echoes of someone else's thoughts. The transformation was complete in ways that went beyond simple exhaustion or disillusionment. He had become something that could no longer function in the world of normal human interaction, but he was also no longer fully committed to the world of shadows and violence that had sustained him for so long. He existed in a kind of liminal space between the two, belonging fully to neither, welcome in none. It was a lonely place, but it was also strangely peaceful, free from the constant calculations and compromises that had once governed every moment of his existence. The ancient world had little tolerance for such in-between creatures, beings that defied easy categorization and challenged the neat boundaries that kept society functioning. They were the walking reminders of possibilities that most people preferred not to contemplate, living proof that the line between civilization and barbarism was thinner and more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. Such individuals were typically dealt with through exile or execution, not out of malice, but from recognition that their very existence threatened the stability of the social order. They could not be allowed to remain among normal people, lest their corruption spread like a plague, but neither could they be simply ignored, for they possessed knowledge and capabilities that made them potentially dangerous, even in their isolation. Zifron understood this dynamic perfectly, having lived with its consequences for most of his adult life. He was both too dangerous to be welcomed and too valuable to be simply eliminated, a resource that various powers might wish to exploit, but none would want to claim as their own. It was a precarious position that required constant vigilance and perfect judgment, qualities that his deteriorating mental state made increasingly unreliable. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the landscape around him. The hills rolled away like frozen waves, covered in the sparse vegetation that managed to survive in this harsh climate. Olive trees dotted the slopes, their silver-green leaves catching the light in ways that reminded him of the groves around his childhood home. But these trees were wild and untended, their fruit small and bitter, bearing little resemblance to the carefully cultivated orchards of his youth. Everything in this land seemed to exist in a state of barely controlled decay, beautiful from a distance, but revealing its essential barrenness when examined closely. It was an appropriate setting for a man whose own life had followed a similar trajectory, appearing from the outside to be filled with adventure and purpose, but proving upon closer inspection to be hollow and ultimately meaningless. The parallels between his personal situation and the broader condition of the ancient world were not lost on Xiphron. This was an era of endings, when the old certainties were crumbling, and new forms of order had not yet emerged to replace them. Empires rose and fell with increasing frequency. Kings were made and unmade by the shifting loyalties of their subjects, and the gods themselves seemed to be withdrawing from active involvement in human affairs. In such times, men like Xiphron flourished not because they were particularly skilled or wise, but because they were willing to do things that others would not contemplate. They filled the spaces left by the collapse of traditional authority, providing services that no legitimate institution would offer. They were the antibodies of a diseased social system, symptoms of corruption rather than causes of it. But like all such creatures, they were ultimately self-limiting. Their very success in exploiting the weakness of the system hastened its collapse, and when that collapse finally came, they would be among the first casualties. The world they had helped to create would have no place for them, and they would be swept away, along with all the other relics of a dying age. This understanding brought with it a kind of melancholy satisfaction, the recognition that his own destruction was part of a larger pattern of death and renewal that had governed human affairs since the beginning of time. He was not merely a failed individual, but a representative of a failing order, and his fate was bound up with forces far greater than his own personal choices and limitations. The road began to descend toward a small village nestled in the valley below, perhaps 24 houses clustered around a well and a modest shrine to some local deity. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could hear the distant sounds of daily life. Children playing, women talking as they drew water, men calling to their animals. It was a scene of peaceful domesticity that seemed to belong to a different world from the one he had inhabited for so long. For a moment, Xiphron felt a powerful urge to walk down into that village, to knock on a door and ask for work or shelter, or simply the chance to sit by a fire and listen to normal people discuss normal concerns. He could claim to be a traveling merchant or a discharged soldier, invent some plausible story to explain his presence and his obvious need for assistance. The lies came so easily now that he could construct an entire false identity without conscious effort. But he knew such an attempt would be both futile and dangerous. The hollow quality in his eyes, the unconscious way he scanned for threats and escape routes, the subtle signs that marked him as a creature of violence would be noticed sooner or later. Rural communities were small and close-knit. Strangers were scrutinized carefully, and there were always those who specialized in reading the signs that revealed a man's true nature. More importantly, he no longer possessed the capacity to sustain the kind of emotional connections that normal social interaction required. The part of him that had once been able to laugh at jokes, show interest in other people's problems, or participate in the countless small rituals of human fellowship had been systematically destroyed by years of professional isolation. He could mimic such behaviors, but the mimicry would eventually break down under close examination. The village would have to remain what it had always been for men like him, a distant glimpse of the world he had lost, a reminder of what normal human existence looked like when viewed from the outside. He could observe it, study it, perhaps even envy it, but he could never again be part of it. That possibility had been foreclosed by choices made long ago and consequences that could never be undone. As he stood there looking down at the peaceful scene below, Xiphron became aware of movement on the road behind him. The sound of hoofbeats, carefully muffled but not quite silent, suggested riders who were trying to approach without being detected. His body responded before his mind had fully processed the threat, muscles tensing and hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. But then he stopped, forcing himself to relax and turn slowly to face whatever was approaching. The old reflexes were still there, the trained responses that had kept him alive through countless similar situations, but they seemed less urgent now, less compelling. If these were enemies come to settle old scores, then perhaps it was time to let them do so. If they were merely travelers who happened to be moving with unusual stealth, then no harm would come from a peaceful encounter. The riders who emerged from the morning haze were neither friends nor strangers, but something more dangerous than either. There were 5 of them, well armed and well mounted, with the kind of professional bearing that spoke of military training and extensive combat experience. But it was their leader who made Zifron's blood run cold, for he recognized the face despite the years that had passed since their last meeting. Marcus Lucius Corvus had been a centurion in the Roman legions when Zifron first encountered him. A man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had made him valuable to certain clients who required problems solved with military precision. They had worked together on several contracts, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared expertise rather than anything resembling friendship. But that partnership had ended badly, as such arrangements inevitably did in their profession. A disagreement over payment had escalated into accusations of betrayal, and betrayal in their world was a capital offence that could only be settled with blood. Corvus had sworn an oath to see Zifron dead, and Roman officers were notorious for keeping their promises, no matter how long the delay. "You're a difficult man to find," Corvus said, as his horse came to a stop perhaps 20 paces away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to provide room for manoeuvring if violence erupted. His voice carried the same flat, emotionless tone that Zifron remembered, the vocal equivalent of a blade being drawn from its sheath. "I wasn't trying to be found," Zifron replied, his own voice equally neutral. There was no point in pretending surprise or attempting to negotiate. They both understood why this meeting had occurred and what it would require of them. The only question was whether it would be quick or prolonged, clean or messy. "The families of your victims have been generous in their offers of reward," Corvus continued, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his sword. "Particularly the merchant prince of Tyre. It seems you made quite an impression on his kinsman when you eliminated his competition. They've been very patient, very thorough in their pursuit of justice." The word justice carried a bitter irony that both men recognized but neither acknowledged. In the world they inhabited, justice was simply another word for revenge, and revenge was a commodity that could be bought and sold like grain or bronze or human lives. The families that had hired Corvus were no more interested in cosmic balance than he was. They simply wanted the satisfaction of seeing their enemy destroyed. "How long have you been following me?" Zifron asked, more from curiosity than concern. The outcome of this encounter had been inevitable from the moment Corvus appeared on the road. The only variables now were the details of timing and method. 3 months, Corvus admitted, with what might have been professional pride. "You've grown careless in your old age. Too many patterns, too many predictable choices. The boy who killed his first Philistine 20 years ago would never have been so easy to track." The assessment was probably accurate, though Zifron felt no particular shame at having been outmaneuvered. Age and exhaustion had taken their toll on his abilities, and more importantly, he no longer possessed the desperate hunger for survival that had once made him so formidable. A man who no longer cared deeply about living was at a severe disadvantage when facing someone who still retained that primal drive. "Your men can stay mounted," Zifron said, noting how the other riders had begun to spread out in a classic encirclement pattern. "This won't take long enough to require their direct participation." Corvus smiled, the expression holding no warmth but considerable satisfaction. "I told them you would say something like that. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, but I'm afraid I can't accommodate your desire for a clean ending. My clients have been very specific about their requirements. They want proof that justice has been served, and they want that proof to be comprehensive. The implications were clear enough. This would not be a quick death between professionals, the kind of ending that Zifron might once have hoped for. It would be something far more elaborate and unpleasant, designed as much for the satisfaction of distant enemies as for the practical goal of eliminating a threat. The ancient world was not kind to those who made too many powerful enemies, and Zifron had accumulated more than his share over the years. In that case, he said, drawing his blade with the fluid motion that had become as natural as breathing, we might as well begin. The bronze dagger felt familiar in his grip, its weight and balance as known to him as the sound of his own heartbeat. For a brief moment, muscle memory took over, and he felt something like his old confidence returning. He might be older and wearier than he had been in his prime, but he was still dangerous, still capable of making his enemies pay a price for their victory. But as Corvus dismounted and drew his own weapon, a Roman gladius with its characteristic broad blade and businesslike efficiency, Zifron realized that confidence was not enough. The man facing him was younger, stronger, and backed by 4 mounted soldiers who would intervene if the single combat did not proceed according to their expectations. More importantly, Corvus still possessed the ruthless focus that came from having something to live for, while Zifron fought with the distracted air of a man who had already made his peace with dying. The first exchange of blows confirmed what both men had probably known from the beginning. Zifron was still skilled enough to hold his own for a time, his blade work clean and economical, his footwork steady despite the uneven ground. But Corvus was relentless in a way that his opponent was not, pressing forward with the systematic precision of a man who had reduced killing to a series of technical problems to be solved. The end, when it came, was neither quick nor particularly heroic. Zifron's guard dropped for a fraction of a second, fatigue or distraction or simple resignation, creating an opening that his enemy was trained to exploit. The gladius slid between his ribs with the professional competence that both men had spent their lives perfecting, finding the heart with the kind of accuracy that could only come from extensive practice. As he fell to his knees in the dust of the ancient road, Zifron found himself thinking not of the pain or the approaching darkness, but of the faces he would finally stop seeing in his dreams. The merchant's daughter humming in her garden, the priest praying at his altar, the Philistine soldier whose death had started him on this long, dark journey. Perhaps now they could all rest, knowing that the man who had taken their lives had finally paid the price that the ancient world demanded for such transgressions. The last thing he saw was the peaceful village in the valley below, its cooking fires still sending thin streams of smoke into the morning sky, its people still going about their daily routines, in blessed ignorance of the small drama that had just concluded on the hillside above them. It seemed, somehow, like an appropriate final image for a man whose entire adult life had been spent in the shadows cast by normal human existence. And there, on that dusty road beneath the pale morning sun, the story of Zifron came to its inevitable end. Not with glory or redemption, not with a final moment of heroic defiance, but simply with the quiet settling of accounts that had been 20 years in the making. Corvus wiped his blade clean on the dead man's cloak, his movements methodical and practiced. There was no satisfaction in his face, no triumph, only the weary professionalism of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary task. He had killed many men over the years, but assassins were different from soldiers or bandits. They died with a peculiar emptiness in their eyes, as if death was not an ending, but simply the final confirmation of something that had happened to them long ago. The village in the valley continued its peaceful routine, unaware that one of the ancient world's most feared killers had just breathed his last on the hillside above. Children played in dusty streets, women drew water from the well, men tended their animals and prepared for another day of honest labour. Their ignorance was a mercy, for they would sleep better not knowing what kind of creature had been walking their roads. But perhaps that ignorance itself tells us something important. about the true cost of choosing the assassin's path in biblical times. For all the fear that men like Ziphron inspired, for all the legends that grew up around their deeds, they ultimately died as they had lived in their final years, alone, unmourned, and quickly forgotten by a world that had never truly acknowledged their existence. The ancient texts speak often of the wages of sin, of the prices that must eventually be paid for turning away from righteousness. But they also speak of something else, something that Ziphron perhaps glimpsed in those final moments as he looked down at the peaceful village below. Even in the darkest times, even when evil seems to prosper and the innocent suffer, the ordinary rhythms of human life continue. People still rise with the sun and tend their families. They still draw water and break bread and tell stories to their children as darkness falls. They still believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that tomorrow might be better than today. This quiet persistence of hope and love and daily kindness is perhaps the most powerful force in the ancient world, stronger than any assassin's blade, more enduring than any empire's glory. And so our tale ends, not with the death of a killer, but with the mourning sounds of a village going about its timeless business. The smoke from cooking fires rises into the clear desert air. Children's laughter echoes between mud brick walls. And somewhere a woman hums softly to herself as she kneads dough for the day's bread. Rest now, weary traveller. Let the shadows of ancient violence fade into memory. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts grow quiet as the desert evening settles around us. The assassins of biblical times have long since turned to dust, their terrible skills forgotten, their names erased from history. But the simple human sounds of life continuing, of hope persisting, of love enduring, these echo still across the centuries, a gentle lullaby to carry you into peaceful sleep. The darkness holds no terrors tonight. The ancient roads are empty now, and the only sounds are the whisper of wind through olive groves and the distant call of night birds settling into their roosts. Close your eyes and let the weight of these old stories drift away like sand through your fingers. You are safe, you are warm, you are far from those harsh landscapes where shadows once held such deadly secrets. Sleep well and dream instead of morning light on peaceful villages, of children playing in dusty streets, of all the countless quiet moments that prove, again and again, that love is stronger than fear, hope more enduring than hatred, and the simple act of living with kindness, the greatest victory of all.